Hello. Today we're going to talk about what controls your breathing. Over the past couple of lectures, we've discussed why you breathe, how you get air across your lungs, and several factors like that. Today we're actually going to talk about what determines how much you breathe, how your brain tells your lungs to breathe, and what factors your body is actually monitoring to fine-tune your breathing response. So first we'll talk about this control of breathing, what influences how much you breathe. Then we'll talk about how you respond to exercise, acute exercise, and exercise training. This diagram on the right is the major concept for today, one of them. What it illustrates is all of the information that is coming into your brain to tell your respiratory muscles what to do. So your respiratory muscles are ultimately what decide if you breathe, what make you breathe. It's the action potentials going out to your diaphragm and other respiratory muscles are generated in the respiratory control center, a part of your brain near the medulla oblongata, that integrates information from the rest of the body to determine how much you breathe. So we'll talk about where that information is coming from and what matters most in determining how much you breathe. So this diagram, I put it in to illustrate one simple concept, that how much you breathe and what determines how much you breathe is very complicated. We have your brain here and all these factors. If you need to sleep, phonation is talking, emotion, temperature, all these other things will influence your breathing rate. So will your muscles, your blood pH, your blood PCO2, all sorts of things can influence how much you're breathing. We're just going to focus on a couple of the main ones and keep in mind that all the information ultimately gets integrated at the brain in the respiratory control center, which will then send information out to the respiratory muscles to contract. So let's start here. So we have our respiratory muscles that actually do the contraction. They get their information from the respiratory control center and the medulla oblongata. We can divide up the factors that influence breathing into 4 general categories. Now, I present it as these 4 categories, not because I really want you to memorize which one falls into each category, but so that you can kind of get the concept of what your body is monitoring. And if you remember what your body monitors, you can, if it's central versus peripheral or humoral blood or neural, you can kind of remember what things it's actually looking for. So we have central would mean in the brain, and peripheral is everything else. So we'll just write else there. We have humoral factors. Humoral just means anything in the blood. And neural obviously is nervous system. Okay, so we can make a little cross here. We have some factors that your brain monitors that are going through the blood and also the brain-blood barrier, if you guys remember that thing. Factors like PCO2 and ultimately hydrogen ions are monitored within the brain. Now we also have factors, central factors, neural factors. To make this a little cleaner. So the central would be brain and nervous system. So we have, get this, nervous system factors that influence the brain. These are going to be like your afferent nerves that relay information back to the brain, telling the brain how much is going on. You also can have feed-forward factors, which we'll discuss in a second. Then we have these peripheral factors, stuff outside of the brain. So peripheral humoral would be your carotid bodies, aortic bodies. These factors, these aortic and carotid bodies monitor PCO2 and pH in the blood. Then you can have peripheral neural factors. These are actually going to be more of the muscle afferents. So like your type 3-4 afferents, where the muscle afferents, these sensory organs, are relaying information back to the brain. The central neural factors, these are mostly higher brain centers that as you're trying to generate your action potentials for your contraction, these higher brain centers will relay information over to the respiratory control center about how hard it is. So the primary drive to increase ventilation comes from higher brain centers. So just by thinking about exercising or preparing to exercise, you will begin to increase your ventilation rate. These are from all the other processes in your brain that are getting you ready to do that muscle contraction, also signal over to the respiratory control center to start breathing in anticipation of exercise. Peripheral chemoreceptors, these are going to, the peripheral chemoreceptors, these would be over here in the carotid bodies, aortic bodies. We'll talk about this more in a second. And then skeletal muscle, mechano, and chemoreceptors. Most of this would kind of fit in the peripheral neural area. There's some things that might come into a gray zone where it might not be clear if it's a peripheral humoral or peripheral neural. If you get into the details, don't worry so much about that. Just remember what's being monitored. So central neural factors. So as I mentioned, you have the respiratory control center that's going to be in this general area in the pons and the medulla oblongata area of the brainstem. All information from different parts of the brain are going to be fed into that area. One of the sources of information is just the motor cortex. So if we go over here, so you'd have like the motor cortex up here somewhere. As you generate action potentials to go, as you generate action potentials to go do your contraction, those action potentials also will signal over to that respiratory control center and tell it to increase your ventilation rate. So just by telling yourself to exercise and contract, by default, the brain is already going to increase your ventilation without any feedback about if the breathing is enough or not. Just the anticipation of exercise is going to increase your breathing. Some of the really cool studies to show this, let's see if I have this on here. There's several studies in the early 2000s where they found people that were susceptible to hypnosis, and they would put them laying down on a bed and tell them that they were exercising. And so in their brain, they think they're exercising, but they're not. And just by having them think that they're exercising, their breathing rate, their heart rate, and several other things actually increased. This is just to show you that you can have an increase in ventilation because of these feed-forward systems in the brain, that the thought of exercise and preparing to exercise increases ventilation in anticipation of the need of greater breathing. Now we have these central humoral factors also. These central humoral factors in your brain, you have the blood flowing through the vessels, right? So here we have a blood vessel, and in the cerebral spinal fluid, you have factors that will monitor the pH. The problem is, if we look at this, because of the blood-brain barrier, it's where your endothelial cells have very tight junctions and don't allow stuff to pass through the brain barrier very easily. Hydrogen, the acid, which is monitored in the cerebral spinal fluid, can't really get out of the arteries or the capillaries. So here's where the bicarbonate buffer system comes into play. Remember how hydrogen and CO2 are in equilibrium through the bicarbonate buffer? So what happens is if you have an increase in hydrogen or acidity, that leads to an increase in the CO2. And CO2 is actually fully capable of getting out of the blood-brain barrier and getting into the cerebral spinal fluid and over to the receptors, the chemoreceptors in the brain. that are sensitive to the pH. As pH drops, ventilation will increase in anticipation of exercise. Trying to predict what is going to happen with ventilation with these different signals is actually very, very simple usually. Just think what happens during exercise. pH goes down, you get more acidic, and what happens during exercise to your breathing, it increases. Right? So that's kind of what we're looking at there. Now we also have peripheral humoral factors. You have these very important carotid and aortic bodies in your arteries. This is very important. These are in the arterial circulation, not the venous circulation. These bodies, some of them coming somewhere around here and at the bifurcation of the carotid artery, and others right in here at the aortic arch. They're in the artery, and they monitor primarily the PCO2. This is the big thing that they're going to be looking at, is PCO2. So what happens when you exercise? You go through that citric acid cycle, you produce a lot of CO2. You also produce a lot of acid, which drives up CO2. So the body, these carotid bodies and aortic bodies, they're monitoring the pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. And if the pressure of carbon dioxide goes up, then they signal back to the respiratory control center to increase ventilation and take deeper breaths, more frequent breaths. They also are sensitive to the pH or the acidity. But look what comes last on this list, and this is kind of surprising to a lot of people. The pressure of oxygen is one of the last things they're sensitive to in the carotid bodies, and the PO2 is really not even there for the aortic bodies. There's some evidence that says the aortic bodies might be a little sensitive to PO2, but not much. The big take-home message here on what your peripheral humoral factors, or what your body's monitoring to see if your breathing is sufficient, it monitors the pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood. It's not looking at the pressure of oxygen. Now, why would this be wise to look at the pressure of CO2? You're already breathing, right? When you're exercising, you're already breathing. You have these higher brain centers. They've already increased your ventilation. So at the start of exercise, ventilation, if we have a little graph, this is ventilation rate, so VE. Ventilation goes up, right? At the start of exercise. So if we start exercise right here. So as ventilation increases, this is all just because of the higher brain centers. Now, if the higher brain centers adjusted it just right, then you would see not much CO2 or any excess CO2 floating around in the blood. If the higher brain centers maybe underestimated how much you needed to breathe, and you're producing more CO2 and you're not able to get rid of enough CO2 from breathing, and it shows up on the arterial side, that signals for you to increase ventilation even more. So you monitor the CO2 to fine-tune the response. The initial major adjustment in your ventilation comes from these higher brain centers. At the start of exercise, they give a rough estimate of how much you're going to need to breathe. And then factors like the PCO2 tell the body how to fine-tune it. And the rationale is, if you have extra carbon dioxide floating in your arterial blood, that means that your lungs aren't breathing enough to get rid of it, and you need to breathe more. So what about oxygen? Let's talk about oxygen. You're not sensitive to oxygen until you get to critically low levels. Here are some diagrams. This shows the relationship between arterial PCO2 and the ventilation. So at rest, you might have an arterial PCO2 somewhere around 40. And as you start to increase in exercise intensity, even little increases in arterial PCO2 result in a big increase in ventilation. You're very sensitive to CO2. If you increase or decrease the pressure of CO2, your ventilation will adjust accordingly. But look here. So let's say in this scenario, what happens is you put someone have them breathing gases. So you could have them breathe normal oxygen, pure oxygen, all the way down to very hypoxic, low oxygen levels in the gas. And if we're going from a normal level, so you have normal you breathe in and have a normal arterial PO2 somewhere around 100. If we take you down from 100 to 80, you're not going to see much of a change in your ventilation. If we even take you all the way down to about 60, you won't see a whole lot. Somewhere around 60 millimeters of mercury, if you drop below that, it's called the hypoxic threshold. When you drop below that threshold, then you start to see the body caring about oxygen levels. Before that, it didn't. You could change the pressure of oxygen all you want in this range, a little bit, a lot. It's not going to affect your breathing very much because you are more sensitive to CO2. So I'll tell you a little story about this. I was doing a study a couple years ago with a friend, and we actually hooked him up onto this. We had him breathing gas out of a tank, oxygen and carbon dioxide, and we controlled the carbon dioxide levels so that we were able to monitor his CO2 levels in his breath and his arterial blood in real time. And we kept his arterial, the arterial PaCO2 constant. But while we kept the arterial PCO2 constant, we dropped his inhaled oxygen. So normally the air you breathe has 21% oxygen, and we dropped it down to something like 14% oxygen. Now you would think that he would sense that because your body wants oxygen and needs more oxygen, but he had no idea. His ventilation stayed absolutely normal, but his saturation of oxygen, we put a pulse oximeter on him, and we saw his saturation go from 100% saturated hemoglobin down to like 80, and he didn't even blink. He had no idea. He knew because he was because he helped do the study, but he wasn't breathing at all, hard at all. It was because we were manipulating his PCO2. We kept the PCO2 constant, so his body's like, okay, the PCO2 is normal. We don't need to adjust breathing. So that just illustrates that your body is much more sensitive to the CO2. It is a primary driver of breathing in your blood. Oxygen is not terribly sensitive to it until you get to these critical areas. For you and me, healthy individuals, probably not going to hit these critically low PO2s very often. Maybe if we go up to very high altitudes, you can see other populations like people with lung disease, they might have the pressures low enough to where oxygen drives their breathing. But most of the time, CO2 is the major driver of your breathing. Now, other factors that will fine-tune the respiration response can be found within the muscle itself. These type 3-4 afferents that we talked about at the beginning of the year. So type 3, they use Roman numerals, I'm not sure why. So the type 3-4 afferents. Also factors like type 1 and type 2, which are your muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs. These factors, all these afferents, they sense what's going on in the muscle, and they'll relay it back to the brain, to the respiratory control center. So if you have a drop in pH, you get more acidic, or you have a lot of metabolites accumulating because of exercise, that information gets sent back to the brain and your ventilation response is adjusted accordingly. What's really cool also is just the movement. These type 3 afferents, these ones are especially sensitive to just mechanical deformation or movement. And so I could have you come in my lab, and we would have you sit in a chair. And if someone moves your leg for you without you doing any exercise, someone's moving your leg back and forth for you. If we do that, your breathing rate goes up. without any exercise, just because of the movement stimulating these afferent nerves, and the afferents interpret that movement as exercise and send the signal back to the brain saying, hey, we got to increase ventilation, we're exercising here. So the 3-4 afferents, sensitive to metabolites, things produced during exercise like pH, heat, potassium, ADP, all these things can stimulate these afferents and modulate your breathing response. One of my friends at the University of Utah, he's done several studies with these type 3-4 afferents, and in one study, he blocked these. If you remember, the 3-4 afferents, they help with central fatigue. They tell your brain how fatigued the muscle is. And so some of the research he was doing addressed the question, what would happen if we dropped or minimized the communication, the afferent communication between the muscles and the brain? What if the brain doesn't know how tired the muscle is? Can we make the muscle do more work? And so he would have, I did a couple of these studies with him, but it's definitely his studies. He would have people come in and exercise and do a time trial exercise where they get on a bike and ride 5 kilometers on the exercise bike as fast as they can. And then he would do it again, but this, on the second time, he would inject fentanyl into the near the spine to minimize signaling back from the afferent nerves up to the brain. So this is like an epidural, right? So taking out that epidural, what we saw, I showed you these data at the beginning of the year, when we take out the afferent nerves, if we can keep oxygen delivery to the muscles constant, it improves performance by taking out the afferent nerves, showing that you have this little bit of central fatigue that inhibits your performance. But the problem is you have to keeping oxygen delivery constant during this exercise. So what this shows on this graph over here is the ventilation response. So we have minute ventilation during CO2. So when you exercise, your body produces a CO2, and the CO2 tells you how much to breathe, right? But in addition, you'll also have other factors besides CO2 telling you how much to breathe, like these mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors within the muscle. And so if you have a lower ventilation response for a given CO2, that's indicative of hypoventilation. You're not breathing enough. And so when we have these people exercise, the black shows a control, or where we gave them a fake injection. Their ventilation stayed elevated throughout the whole exercise, compared to if we block those afferent nerves. When we blocked the afferent nerves, the brain didn't really know what was going on in the muscle. It didn't have the communication to know how hard that muscle was working, how fatigued it was, how much movement was going on. All that communication was blunted. And so the respiratory response, or the breathing response, was blunted. And because the breathing response was blunted, when these people exercised, they actually had lower oxygen content in their blood. They were hypoventilating, having less oxygen than they needed, and they would deliver less oxygen to the mitochondria, which meant they couldn't exercise as high of an exercise capacity. So even though those afferent nerves contribute to central fatigue, and if you alleviate this central fatigue, you can do more exercise, what happened is the afferent nerves also are very important for dictating your breathing response. And if you blunt the breathing response or make it inappropriate, insufficient for your exercise, you're not going to be able to exercise at a high intensity. As I mentioned at the start of the year, we recently did a study where we repeated all these experiments, and we had people do these exercise tests with the afferents blocked, but we then controlled oxygen delivery and made sure that the delivery of oxygen was sufficient, even though the respiratory response was blunted. We did that by having them breathe pure oxygen. And when we had proper ventilation with the afferents blocked, exercise capacity went up quite a bit. So long story short, your afferent nerves do limit your exercise capacity, keep you from hurting yourself, redlining, so to speak. But the afferent nerves also are responsible for making sure that your respiratory response and your heart rate response are appropriate for and sufficient for the exercise demand. Now, here we have a table that summarizes what we've talked about so far. You can go in, this comes right out of the textbook, talking about the different things that are important for fine-tuning your ventilation. Now let's move on to how does your pulmonary system respond to exercise? It should come to no surprise that ventilation increases rapidly with exercise. So on this graph, we have pulmonary ventilation or minute ventilation. And at the start of exercise, just like our VO2, it goes up and then it will hit a steady state. This is if we are this would probably be in moderate intensity exercise because you get a steady state pretty quickly. What does this remind you of? Look, we have ventilation eventually get to there, so there's this period at the beginning where ventilation might be a little insufficient. This is all related to the O2 deficit. My handwriting is beautiful, you know it is. All right, so ventilation is slow to response. It doesn't go up in a square wave. Just like oxygen consumption, your breathing rate doesn't go up immediately like that. It takes a while for the signals for ventilation to increase it. Right from the start of ventilation, you have those feed-forward mechanisms increasing it. It takes a while to get everything up and rolling, increase more, but as you exercise, then you'll have additional information from the afferents and others to fine-tune it and bring you to where it needs to be. All right, so oxygen or ventilation increases gradually with exercise intensity. If we were looking at something that was more of a heavy intensity exercise, it would probably look something like this and eventually hit a plateau after 10 minutes. If we were looking at severe intensity exercise, it'd go up like that and we'd just fatigue before it ever hits a plateau, right? So same concepts that apply to VO2, ventilation has the same kind of onset kinetics or starting time. As we exercise, you might see a subtle drop in the PO2, and this is in the arterial PO2. That means that right at the start of the exercise intense or the breathing might be a little insufficient. You're not able to breathe or not breathing enough to recover the oxygen that was consumed. But that gets fixed really quickly. Same idea with the CO2. CO2 goes up a little bit, showing that right here might be insufficient breathing for what you're doing, but the body quickly adjusts and breathes sufficiently. Now, this blue line is the pressure of oxygen in arterial blood, P little a, O2. If we looked at pressure of oxygen in venous blood, you'd probably start off somewhere, let's say around 50. And as exercise goes down and increases, the PO2 will go down. Sorry, this pen does weird things. So venous blood, the oxygen's going to go down and the PCO2 will go up. Remember, your body's not monitoring the venous blood for breathing. It doesn't really care how much oxygen is in the vein or how much CO2 is in the vein. It monitors the arterial blood. And the idea behind that is you have the higher brain centers that feed forward from the brain, sets the ventilation to a rate right at the start of exercise. And if that's sufficient, then you shouldn't see CO2 or O2 levels in the arterial blood deviate too much. If you do see CO2 deviate, then you need to breathe more. So it uses the arterial blood it monitors PCO2 primarily in the arterial blood to make sure if the breathing is sufficient. Some conditions can change if you hit a constant or a steady state. Usually constant load exercise at a submaximal intensity, you'll hit this steady state, especially if you're in moderate or heavy intensity exercise. You'll get ventilation being constant throughout. But when you are in a high high heat or a high humidity environment where you start to accrue body heat, your core temperature increases more than normal, you can actually see that your ventilation rate increases gradually. Even though you're not running any faster, you just breathe harder and harder as time goes on. There are a couple of reasons thought to be for this. One of them, your carotid bodies appear to be sensitive to temperature. So as you exercise in the heat, blood temperature is going to go up more than normal, and the carotid bodies sense that and increase ventilation. But then the question would be, what connection does ventilation or breathing have to do with temperature? Think about your dog or your neighbor's dog. When they exercise or when they're excited, they pant a lot, right? Panting is a way to release heat from your body. We use it only a little bit. We can lose some of our heat from our breath. If you just exhale right now, you can feel the breath is hot, right? And so increasing ventilation seems to be a way to get rid of some of our excess heat, although it's not terribly effective and isn't the main way we do that. As you'll see in a couple weeks, sweating and evaporation of sweat is the main way that we dissipate our heat. But the moral of this story is that during constant load exercise and heavy or moderate intensity exercise, you'll get a steady state in ventilation unless you're in a hot environment. If you're in a hot environment, even if you're doing a pretty light intensity exercise, your ventilation will continue to climb over time. So what happens to ventilation during a graded exercise? Graded exercise, remember, is you start at a light intensity and increase the intensity every minute or two. Let's focus in on the ventilation here. With this one, in an untrained person, they're showing that as you get closer and closer to VO2 max, ventilation increases. And they show it to be kind of not linear. It's a little clearer on this elite athlete person. So here what they illustrate for an elite trained runner. Measuring breathing rate as they run at different percentages of their VO2 max. So they're increasing exercise intensity, and as exercise intensity increases, ventilation goes up pretty linearly until right about here on this guy or girl, ventilation, the slope then changes. This is called the ventilatory threshold. So ventilatory threshold. It's really similar to the lactate threshold when it occurs. It happens really close to the same intensity. And they're not due to the exact same reasons. In fact, what causes the ventilatory threshold or what causes your breathing to spike at this intensity, it's not exactly clear what's going on physiologically at this point. So a lot of people will use this ventilatory threshold, this spike in breathing, as a surrogate or a marker of the lactate threshold. To get someone's lactate threshold, you have to draw blood. It's not always the most comfortable. And so with this, we can get an idea of exercise intensity and lactate threshold just by monitoring their breathing with that spike. Here are some things that will kind of give you some insight. Look what's going on with the pH. pH is dropping, and you can see the slope of the pH on this guy or girl increases as you get to higher intensity. Remember that pH goes into equilibrium with CO2, carbon dioxide. So if you get more acidic, that means you're going to have more CO2, and CO2 drives your breathing, right? So that kind of explains a little bit why ventilation would spike at the ventilatory threshold. Seems like acid contributes to it, but there have been some studies that have shown that this spike in ventilation occurs even without acid accumulation. One other really cool thing that happens when you're exercising has to do with the pressure of oxygen. So let's look at this PO2. In healthy and young individuals, the pressure of oxygen in the artery, so this should really be P(a)O2, pressure of oxygen in the arterial circulation, In healthy individuals, you don't see much of a change in the PaO2. Here they show it going from 100 down to like 95%. That might even be an exaggeration. I've done plenty of studies here in Utah where we have people go all the way up to max, and they show maybe a 1% change in their oxygen content or the pressure of oxygen in their arteries, indicating that usually the breathing is sufficient in a healthy young adult to get enough oxygen loaded onto the hemoglobin. One thing that happens is something called exercise-induced hypoxemia. Look at this elite level person. So this would be someone running competitively, maybe internationally, or at least like highly trained college level runner. The pressure of oxygen goes down a little bit. Here showing that their ventilation is more or less sufficient at these lower intensities. But then when they get to a point right around here, what is this, somewhere around 75% of VO2 max for this person, they desaturate. They're not getting a high pressure of oxygen into the lungs, or through the lungs into the blood. This is called exercise-induced hypoxemia. Now there are a couple of thoughts on what causes this, but first off, you should understand that it happens most of the time with highly trained individuals. If you're just like a recreational athlete that goes running 3 times a week, probably not going to happen to you. You'll probably look more like this untrained student here. But if you're like at least a national class, all-American level person, you have a higher risk of having your lungs be insufficient. At multiple times during this course, we've talked about how the lungs are overbuilt and usually are not limiting. In individuals, like highly trained individuals, the heart gets so adapted and so strong that while the heart is usually a major limitation in healthy young people, in these trained individuals, the heart is so strong that it's able to pump more blood to the heart than the heart can oxygenate. And so one of the thoughts of what's going on with this exercise-induced hypoxemia or the desaturation is that at really high intensities, cardiac output goes up really high. So the how much blood the heart is pumping increases to really fast rates. And the faster the heart pumps blood through the body and through the lungs, the less time the hemoglobin has being exposed to oxygen. That's called transit time, the amount of time that the hemoglobin is in the capillary exposed to oxygen. It's only when the hemoglobin and that red blood cell are in the capillary exposed to oxygen that you can oxygenate the blood. If the red blood cells are passing by the capillaries and the alveoli so fast, it's conceivable that the red blood cell makes it through the capillary before all of the heme is actually oxygenated. If we go back to an example where comparing heme to a school bus, that'd be a lot like having a school bus go to pick up kids at the bus stop, but not stop fully. And so the kids have to like scramble to get on the bus before it gets away. And if the bus is going really quickly, you can't get all the kids on the bus. So that's kind of one of the thoughts of what's going on with this exercise-induced hypoxemia. At high intensities, these elite level athletes have such high cardiac outputs that it could decrease the time of the red blood cell next to the alveoli, which doesn't give it enough time to get oxygenated. Other things that can be a factor are shunts. There's evidence that in many people you have shunts that take blood from artery to vein, just bypassing the lungs. Normally the blood coming out of the pulmonary artery goes to the lungs and gets oxygenated and then comes back to the heart through the pulmonary vein. There's evidence that shows that some people have arteries that can open up, or shunts that can open up at high intensity exercise during high pressures, that they open up and offer like a bypass, a shortcut It goes directly from the artery to the vein, bypassing the lungs. And so you have blood that doesn't even get to the lungs and doesn't get oxygenated. So that can happen in some people. Other things that happen are the bore shift. If you remember, if this is our percent saturation, oxyhemoglobin saturation curve with our PO2, normally it looks something like that, where we have this plateau on the end where at the lungs we can move over, we can change the pressure of oxygen a little bit, and we'll still get fully saturated. One of the thoughts that could be going on with this hypoxemia is that during intense exercise, these people might shift the curve over so much that at a given PO2, now they're not getting fully saturated, they're only getting 80% saturated or something like that. So that's another thing that could be taking place with this hypoxemia. At any rate, whatever the cause is, having blunted oxygenation in the blood, oxygen levels in the blood, is going to decrease oxygen delivery to the muscle and impair exercise performance. So in terms of exercise performance, this would not be a good thing for this athlete, and you'd want to make sure that it doesn't happen. One other thing, so these are in healthy people. A lot of you guys and girls are going to go off to be medical professionals. And if you have someone that has poor lung function like COPD or pneumonia, the arterial PO2 during exercise can actually drop a lot more. And you'd see oxygen saturation of arterial blood with your pulse oximeter, that would drop a lot. In healthy, normal people, our lungs are usually sufficient to keep oxygen levels at the right level. If you have poor health in the lungs with pneumonia or probably this COVID-19, you're probably going to desaturate, not get enough oxygen through the alveoli into the blood, and impair exercise performance and cause high levels of fatigue that way. All right, now let's wrap it up by talking about if the lungs respond to exercise training. In the past, we've talked about the muscles, right? Muscles, when you strength train, they get bigger. When you endurance train, they get more mitochondria. They get increase in capacity. We'll talk later about the heart. As you endurance train, the heart adapts and gets bigger, and it can pump more blood. What about the lungs? What goes on with the alveoli, the bronchioles, the trachea, all of that? The answer to the question, do the lungs respond to exercise training or do they adapt? No. The number of alveoli that you have is not really going to change with exercise training. The size of your bronchioles doesn't really seem to change with exercise training. The lungs are overbuilt to begin with, and it seems like they've nearly maximized how big they can be for the size of your rib cage and your chest. So they can't get that much bigger. So you're not going to have more alveoli with exercise training or anything like that. But your breathing responses do adapt to exercise training. Even though the structure of the lung isn't really going to change with exercise training, you will see adaptations in your respiratory response. One of the things that you'll see is a decreased ventilatory response. So let's say we take you and we have you ride on a bike and we measure your ventilation, how much you're breathing at different exercise intensities, at 100 watts, 150 watts, 200 watts. So this red line would be up here, I guess it's really teal. That line represents your breathing response to exercise before training. And then we have you go exercise train for 10 weeks, and you're actually going to have a lower ventilatory response to that same exercise intensity. So riding at 100 watts before, you used to breathe at about 45 liters per minute. Now you're only breathing at 35. Riding at 200 watts, you used to require 80 liters per minute, and now you can get away with just 60. Right, so the question is, why? Do you need less oxygen when you endurance train? If you guys remember from our last unit, if we look at the VO2 response to exercise training. We just have power down here, just our same graph. If we look at the VO2 before training and then after training, it's pretty much the same. Very subtle differences where you might be a little more efficient after training, require a little less oxygen, but nothing like this over here. So it's not that you require less oxygen to do the exercise. You still need the same amount of oxygen, same amount of ATP to do the exercise. Why are you breathing less? The reason for this comes back to the stuff that stimulates your ventilation. If you remember, your ventilation, big influences on ventilation are going to come down to the PCO2, the pressure of CO2 in your arteries, and then the pH. What happens with exercise training to the muscle? You get the muscles become more type 1, or they at least have more mitochondria. And the more mitochondria you have, the less acid you produce. And the less acid you produce, the lower the CO2. The lower the CO2, the less the drive for breathing. Think of it this way. CO2 is a major stimulus for your breathing. After training, you're going to have a lower CO2, lower pressure of CO2 in your blood because you're producing less CO2 and less acid. You have these type 1 fibers that have more mitochondria. They produce less acid. All of that's going to result in you having less CO2. And so that's one of the reasons why if you go exercising with your roommate or your friend who's ridiculously out of shape, and you guys, if you weigh the same amount, you're running at the same pace, you're doing the exact same power, exact same work, but one of you, the one that's out of shape, is going to be breathing very heavily. And part of that is because, if we go back to our size principle, you remember this. Where we have different fiber types. This would be like type 1. We have type 2s, 2A, 2A, 2X. For you, when you're running at that 5 miles per hour, whatever it is with your friend, you're primarily using these fiber types, the type 1. But your friend might be using all of them. And when you're using those type 2 fibers, they're going to produce more acid and CO2. And that's going to drive up your ventilation. So that's one of the reasons why you have a decreased ventilatory response with exercise training. It's not because you consume less O2. It's because you just have less stimulus for breathing. So question, when we talk about VO2 max, we've talked a lot about VO2 max throughout this unit. The lungs usually don't limit a person's VO2 max. A young, healthy individual, the lungs have more than enough capacity to get the job done. In individuals that have diseases, lung disease, or even older individuals like 80-year-olds and up, the lungs start to become more of a factor where they might not be able to keep up with the heart, and so they limit the delivery of oxygen into the blood. Other scenarios like we looked at with elite level individuals, like high class distance runners, they can get that exercise-induced hypoxemia, which can then impair their exercise performance and their VO2 max. We'll talk probably near the end of the semester, we'll have a chance to talk about racehorses, like those that do the Kentucky Derby. And these racehorses have been bred to have really high VO2 max and exercise capacity. Normally, the heart is one of the main constraints for a healthy individual and a healthy animal. What the breeders of these horses didn't realize is they were breeding horses for faster and faster horses over generations, is that they were breeding horses that had bigger and bigger hearts. And while in a normal horse, the heart might not be stronger than the lungs, with the heart still being the limiting factor, in these horses like Secretariat or the Kentucky Derby horses, their hearts they've been bred for such huge hearts that they're actually bigger than the lungs. There's my crappy lung. They're bigger than the lungs, and so the lungs are the limiting factor in aerobic performance in these racehorses. and potentially in the equivalent of racehorses and people like our elite level athletes. All right, so let's wrap it up just talking a little bit more about exercise training. Can you exercise train the lungs? Not so much the lungs themselves, but you can train the respiratory muscles. Your respiratory muscles, like your diaphragm, it's a skeletal muscle, just like your quadriceps, just like your biceps. It's a skeletal muscle, and it can fatigue. And the more you breathe and the more pressure you require your respiratory muscles to generate, the more likely they are to fatigue. And as they fatigue, they require more blood to the respiratory muscles, which means there's less blood for your quadriceps or your locomotor muscles to do the exercise. So fatigued diaphragm equals less blood to other parts of the body, which means lower VO2 max. Lots of studies have shown if you fatigue the respiratory muscles, like if I have you breathe against a resistance, so all this woman is doing, she's breathing against this device, which is basically like a straw. It has a very small airway that doesn't let air out very quickly, so she has to push really hard to get air out. That causes the diaphragm, and that would be the expiratory muscles to push out, and then to inhale, same story, and the diaphragm has to generate a lot of pressure. You can use these simple devices to train your respiratory muscles. And if you do that, doing like 30 sets or 30 repetitions 2 or 3 times a day has been shown to increase the strength of the respiratory muscles and decrease their fatigability. And if you're not fatiguing the respiratories as much, that means that they are not going to contribute to terminating exercise. That also means that they're not going to require as much blood, and that means more blood and oxygen for the locomotor muscles. So that would be more blood here to your quads and more oxygen to do the running, and less blood would be needed here in their diaphragm to perform the breathing. That's going to be one of the benefits of this respiratory training. You're not going to change the alveoli or anything like that, but you're training the skeletal muscles in charge of ventilation. And people who do this for like endurance performance, like a 5K or something, like of that distance, studies show that it's usually about a 3 to 5% improvement in performance in trained athletes. So if you're like a cross-country runner and you're looking to get that last little edge, doing something like this where you just train those respiratory muscles might be something worth doing. Don't do it during your workout. Do it in addition to your normal exercises. There's other studies like using this respiratory muscle training for people like COPD patients can also be very beneficial. Have you guys ever seen these? They're not as popular as they used to be. Elevation training mask is what they call them. Some people call them a Bane mask. So this guy just has a mask on and the air has to come through these little holes. All it is a fancy way, a mask version of this. So they have to breathe through very small holes, and that means the diaphragm and the respiratory muscles, they have to generate larger amounts of force for a given amount of breathing. They advertise this as elevation. They say it mimics elevation. It does not mimic elevation whatsoever. Elevation decreases the pressure of oxygen in your blood. Study after study have shown that these elevation masks do not affect the pressure of oxygen in your blood. It doesn't mimic going to Everest. It doesn't mimic going to Utah or anything. It's not the same. But it's inspiratory and expiratory muscle training. So you can buy one of these masks for like $80 and breathe through it during some exercise. Or you could do these things on Amazon are like $5 or $10. Right? So it's the same effect here. Now, if you go to the gym, you might see someone like get on a treadmill or wear this while lifting. Most of the time, like here we have a football player wearing it. A lot of times they were advertised on weightlifters, CrossFitters trying to get that edge. It would have absolutely no benefit as far as I can tell, and as far as the data suggest, this would have no benefit, nor would this would have no benefit for resistance type exercise. It's only going to have a benefit in performance when you get to stuff that is like a 5K, something that's going to require the respiratory muscles to fatigue. By training this way, you're going to train the respiratory muscles to not fatigue as much, and you'll be able to go longer before they fatigue. This is going to be aerobic exercise, not any kind of anaerobic exercise. The other thing is that if you did get something like this, it's not the wisest to use it during your normal workout, because when you have this on, if you put it on and you get on the treadmill and try to run your 5K for the day, you're not going to be able to run as much, and you're decreasing your intensity. And so your leg muscles are going to not get as trained. And so it's not as much of an overload on the rest of your body. And so what would be recommended is to do something respiratory muscle in addition to your normal training. Don't make your normal training the respiratory muscle training, because the rest of your systems are going to take a hit because it's light intensity. It'll be light intensity. So you could do this on top of your normal training. It's not elevation, doesn't mimic it at all, but it can have a benefit for endurance training, which is really not what they advertise anyway. I'm going to leave this one for you guys. I want you to study this out. This might show up on an exam at some point. Knowing what factors affect the content of oxygen in your arteries, figure out how hyperoxia would affect the pressure, the CaO2. I'll look through your notes, find out the equation for VO2 max. There's something called the Fick principle that I introduced at the start of the pulmonary section, probably the first slideshow. Look for the Fick principle and see if you can figure out how CaO2, the content of oxygen in the artery and vein, how that would figure into VO2 max and how that's going to be affected by hyperoxia. All right, that was kind of a longer one today. I apologize, but you can fast forward, do this at double speed if you want. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a great day.